Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Wastelands by Stephen King. Now, The Wastelands was published in 1991, and this is the third book of Stephen King's Dark Tower series. The first two books in this series being The Gunslinger, which was published in 1982, and The Drawing of the Three, which was published in 1987. Now, this book, of course, gets its title from the T.S. Eliot poem The Wasteland. Now, the basic plotline of the Dark Tower series overall is it's set primarily in this alternate universe known as Midworld, which is a world very different from our own. At the same time, though, it bears a lot of similarities to our world, and it's heavily implied that this world used to be a lot like our world thousands of years ago. And the series follows this man named Roland Deschain, who is the last gunslinger. Now, gunslingers in this world were basically this elite group of peacekeepers, and it was their job to maintain peace and order in Midworld, but there was a war years prior to the events of the first book that wiped out all the gunslingers with the exception of Roland, and throughout the series, Roland is looking for this thing called the Dark Tower, which actually holds the time-space continuum together. And throughout the series, Roland comes to understand that Midworld is just part of a long chain of parallel universes that are all held together by the Dark Tower. Now, this particular book in the Dark Tower series actually has a really complex plotline. Like, there's a lot going on in this book, and in order to explain the plotline of this book, I will have to give away what could be considered some minor spoilers, so just keep that in mind when you're watching this review. Also, in order to explain the plotline of this book, I will have to be giving away some spoilers about what happened in the first two books. Now, in the first book, The Gunslinger, you realize that Roland has already been looking for the Dark Tower for a number of years now, and in that book he meets this young boy named Jake. Now, Jake is basically an alien to Midworld. It turns out that Jake is actually from another dimension. That other dimension, as it turns out, is actually our world. It turns out that Jake was actually murdered in our world in the year 1977, and after he died, he somehow came back to life in Midworld. And throughout the first book, Roland had to defend Jake against these supernatural creatures that inhabited his world, but at the end of that book, Jake does die again in Midworld, and I don't want to give away how he died, but it was kind of Roland's fault that he died. Now, in the second book, The Drawing of the Three, Roland finds out that in order to continue on his quest for the Dark Tower, he has to go into this other dimension that Jake was from, which once again was our world, and he has to draw three people from our world and bring him into his world to join him on this quest for the tower. And he has to enter our world in different time periods. So first he goes into our world in the year 1987, and he meets this man named Eddie Dean, who is a heroin addict, and he eventually brings Eddie into Midworld. And then he goes into our world in the year 1964, and he meets this wheelchair-bound African-American woman named Odetta Holmes, who actually has split personality disorder, and her alternate personality is this woman named Detta Walker, and throughout the whole book she's unaware of the fact that she has split personality, and Roland has to take her into Midworld to join him and Eddie on the quest for the Dark Tower. And eventually in the second book, Roland goes into our world in the year 1977, which was the year that Jake was killed in our world, and he meets this serial killer named Jack Mort, who, as it turns out, was the one who killed Jake, and he ends up killing Jack before Jack could kill Jake, and so he prevents Jake from dying in our world. Now, throughout the second book, you also see Eddie start to overcome his heroin addiction, and Odetta ends up finding out that she does have split personality disorder, and somehow her two personalities merge together into one personality, and now she goes by the name Susanna, and Susanna and Eddie end up becoming lovers. Now, the plot of this book is actually broken up into two halves, and a criticism that I would have of this novel is I actually feel like the book should have been broken up into two separate novels, because there's kind of a conflicting style of pacing within the first half of the novel and then the second half of the novel. So, in my personal opinion, I feel like this book should have been broken up into two separate books, but once again, that's just my opinion. Now, the plot of the first half of this novel is it begins in Midworld a few weeks after the events of the Drawing of the Three, and Roland is training Eddie and Susanna how to be gunslingers, and Roland, Eddie, and Susanna all make up what Roland calls a Ka-Tet. Now, a Ka-Tet is this tight-knit group of people who are all brought together by fate or destiny or God, whichever you want to call it. And in Midworld, the word Ka means destiny. Now, the first half of this novel deals with this time paradox that Roland has created. Now, as I mentioned before, at the end of the second book, Roland kills Jack Mort, who is the one who killed Jake in our world, but the only reason Roland ever met Jake was because Jake died in our world and then came back to life in Midworld. So, because Roland killed Jack before Jack could kill Jake, that means Roland technically never met Jake. So, this has created a time paradox that is tearing Roland apart psychologically. And Roland, Eddie, and Susanna all realize that if they don't fix this time paradox, Roland could go completely insane and could be a danger to himself and Eddie and Susanna. So the first half of this novel is really about the Ka-Tet trying to fix this time paradox, and it turns out that the same thing that's happening to Roland in Midworld is actually happening to Jake in our world. Like, Jake is living in Manhattan as this seemingly normal 11-year-old boy, but the thing is, Jake remembers being killed and then coming back to life in this other dimension, even though that technically never happened. So this is also starting to really mess with Jake's head psychologically. So both Roland and Jake are on the verge of going insane. And it turns out the only way to fix this time paradox is to bring Jake into Midworld, and I don't want to give away how they do that, but it involves both Jake in our world and the Ka-Tet in Midworld finding this dimensional gateway that bridges the two dimensions, but it turns out this gateway is actually guarded by a demon, and I don't want to give away how they face this demon, but the way they face this demon is actually pretty fucked up, honestly. So that's the plot of the first half of the novel. Now, in the second half of this novel, Jake has officially joined the Ka-Tet, and he's trying to adjust to this new life in this other dimension, Midworld, and eventually Jake meets this Billy Bumbler. Now, Billy Bumblers are these strange animals that are native to Midworld. Basically, Billy Bumblers are kind of like a cross between a raccoon and a dog and a badger, and they actually have limited speaking abilities, and Jake ends up befriending this Billy Bumbler who he calls Oi, and eventually Oi unofficially joins the Ka-Tet. Like, in a sense, he really does kind of join the Ka-Tet, even though he's not a human. So, in order to continue on their quest for the Dark Tower, Roland, Eddie, Susanna, Jake, and Oi have to go through this city called Lud. Now, Lud is almost like this post-apocalyptic version of New York City, which adds to the whole idea that Midworld used to be a lot like our world thousands thousands of years ago, and basically in this city, Lud, there's a civil war going on between these two groups of people. And one of these groups of people is led by this man named Andrew Quick, who also goes by the name the Tick-Tock Man. And the Tick-Tock Man ends up being the primary antagonist of the second half of the novel. Now, I don't want to give away everything that happens in this city, but they eventually find out that everything going on in this city is controlled by this living train called Blaine. Now, the people living in the city believe that Blaine is actually possessed by a demon or an evil spirit, but it turns out that Blaine is actually an artificial intelligent computer system that was actually built by this ancient civilization of people who once lived in Midworld thousands of years ago, and Blaine controls not just this train, but once again, he controls everything that's going on in the city of Lud. And now the Ka-Tet have to get out of this city, but it turns out that Blaine may be the only thing that can get them out of the city of Lud. Now, The Wastelands, I thought, was a really good addition to the Dark Tower series. Once again, my main issue with this book is really some of the pacing in the book. Like, to me, this book does have a few pacing issues, because the first half of the novel moves at sort of a slow pace. Like, it's not boring by any means, it's just slow, but it's necessarily slow to explain everything that's going on. But then the second half of the novel is almost like a roller coaster ride. Like, once they enter the city of Lud, it's almost non-stop action, and it's just, to me, there's a lot of pacing issues, because the first half of the novel and the second half of the novel move at radically different paces. But aside from some of the issues of pacing, overall, I did really enjoy this novel. Now, in this book, you do get a lot of really good character development, particularly with the relationship between Roland and Jake, because you realize that Roland and Jake have very much a father-son kind of relationship, and it's actually very moving, especially because in the parts of this book that take place in our world in the 1970s, when you see Jake in our world, you realize that Jake's father really isn't the best father in the world, and you realize that Roland, in a lot of ways, was more of a father to Jake than Jake's actual father. Another really cool thing about this book is it really does expand upon the Dark Tower mythos much more, and it explains a lot more stuff about Midworld. For example, in this book you find out a lot more about the ancient civilization of people who once lived in Midworld, who Rowling calls the Great Old Ones, which was a little H.P. Lovecraft reference, but it turns out that thousands of years ago, these people advanced so much in their technology that they actually created artificial intelligence, like Blaine, and it's kind of unclear. Like, Stephen King does leave a lot of stuff about the Great Old Ones ambiguous, but you kind of get the idea that because magic does exist in Midworld, and you kind of get the idea that the Great Old Ones combined science and magic, and that was ultimately their undoing, but it's really kind of unclear exactly what happened to the Great Old Ones. You don't know if, like, the artificial intelligence that they created, like the machines, you don't know if the machines, like, took them over and wiped most of them out, or you also get the implication, though, that there may have been a nuclear war. Like, you're not really sure exactly what brought about the downfall of the Great Old Ones, and King intentionally leaves a lot of that ambiguous, which is something I really liked. And one thing I really liked about this is, even though this is a fantasy novel, there's a lot of sci-fi elements in this book. Like, there are robots and cyborgs in this novel, and I've always been a fan of that when science and magic gets combined in storytelling. Like, I've always been a fan of, like, when a writer, like, incorporates sci-fi elements into a world where there's magic. And once again, I thought it was really interesting, this combination of science fiction and fantasy, and the second half of this novel almost works as sort of a cyberpunk kind of novel in a way. Also, in this book, you find out a lot more about the Dark Tower. For example, in this novel, you find out about the beams. Now, the beams are these force fields that hold the Dark Tower in place, and it turns out that each beam has a guardian. Each of these guardians takes on the form of a different animal. Now, one thing that's never 100% made clear in this book is whether or not the Great Old Ones actually created the Guardians, because there's a certain point in this novel where the Ka-Tet run into one of the Guardians, which is this giant grizzly bear, but it turns out this grizzly bear is actually a cyborg created by the Great Old Ones. And you're never quite sure if, like, all the Guardians are supposed to be cyborgs and, like, the Great Old Ones actually created them, or if they were already these godlike beings that already existed, and the Great Old Ones only created these cyborgs as sort of their physical counterparts in Midworld. I personally think the Guardians already existed even before the Great Old Ones, because one of the Guardians, the turtle, is also basically a god, because the turtle also created some of the universes that the Dark Tower holds in place. But once again, despite a few pacing problems, overall I could definitely say that The Wastelands is a really good book and is a great addition to the Dark Tower series, and it's a really unique mix between fantasy, science fiction, horror, cyberpunk, and sort of a post-apocalyptic novel as well. It really is a great book. Once again, my only issue is I feel like the first half and the second half really should have been two separate novels, but that's just my personal opinion. Now, as the series went on, it was revealed that pretty much all of Stephen King's other books connect to the Dark Tower series in some way, shape, or form. Even though not all of Stephen King's books necessarily take place in the same universe, the Dark Tower series explains that there are multiple universes, so all of Stephen King's books are connected to the Dark Tower series in some way, shape, or form, even though they're not all set necessarily in the same exact universe. For example, in this book, you get a few connections to Stephen King's novel It. Like, I mentioned that one of the Guardians is the turtle. Now, the turtle is also a character in It. Now, in the novel It, you found out that the main characters, the Losers Club, were being guided by some kind of a higher power in their quest to defeat It. And in that novel, you found out that the thing guiding them was actually this godlike being called the Turtle, who was actually It's enemy, and you get the idea that the same way that the turtle was guiding the main characters of It to defeat Pennywise, the turtle is also guiding Roland and the rest of his Ka-Tet on his quest for the Dark Tower. And if you wanted to, you could make some parallels between Roland's journey and the journey that Bill and the rest of the Losers Club go on in the novel It. And if you wanted to, you could even look at the Losers Club as sort of a Ka-Tet onto itself. Also, in this book, you get a major connection to Stephen King's novel, The Stand. Now, The Stand was already connected to this series because the character of Randall Flagg also appeared in the first two novels. However, in the first two novels, he appeared under the name Walter O'Dim, or the Man in Black, and at this point in the series, you're not supposed to know yet that Randall Flagg and the Man in Black are actually the same person, but Randall Flagg does show up at the end of this book, and even though he doesn't refer to himself as Randall Flagg, the way he's described and just the way he talks, you immediately know it's Randall Flagg, and he even makes a reference to another character from The Stand. Also, in this book, there's a lot of talk about how you have to make a stand against evil, which of course was a major theme in The Stand, and and was a major theme in it as well. So yeah, that's my review on The Wastelands by Stephen King, and bye.